afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Conversation at Noon. My name is Rebecca Tabor. I'm the head of public programs here at the Connecticut Democracy Center at Connecticut's Old State House. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's program, which is focused on historic preservation and diversity. The term historic preservation refers to the efforts to conserve and protect buildings, objects, landscapes, or other artifacts of historical significance. Today's topic really encompasses two aspects of historic preservation: diversity and the sites that are saved, and diversity and the people who work in the field. To start today's program, I'm pleased to welcome Rhone O'Hara to speak about some of her research into this topic. Rhone is a native of Woodstock, Connecticut. She graduated from Trinity College with a bachelor's degree in English, literature, and history. While at Trinity, Rhone wrote an honors English thesis that explored the gender politics of the medieval era and worked at a global nonprofit called Facing History and Ourselves. As a graduate student at Brown University, Rhone engaged in public-facing scholarship that highlights the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the fall of 2020, Rhone created a DEI audit for preservation organizations, and she just recently completed an interview-based capstone titled Finding Ways to Food, Gender and Sites of Citizenship in Providence, Rhode Island, that focuses on issues of race, gender, and food insecurity. And also this spring, she is a recent graduate with her master's in American Studies from Brown University. Welcome, Rhone. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Rebecca. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing screen. I want to begin today with 3 land acknowledgements. I first want to acknowledge that the following research was conducted at Brown University. The Nicholson House, where the American Studies Department is situated, sits on occupied indigenous lands that are the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. I note, too, that I occupy space on a campus that drew its early life's blood from the African slave trade in the Americas, and that there are buildings here constructed by enslaved people. These acknowledgements commit us to a lifetime of anti-racist work. I want to next acknowledge that the lands from where I'm delivering today's presentation in Woodstock, Connecticut, are located in the homeland of the Nipmuc people. And finally, today's program is given in conjunction with Connecticut's Old State House, which rests within the territories of the Massacos, Pukwinuk, Podunks, and Secowog peoples. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you to the panel for including me in this discussion, and Connecticut's Old State House for organizing this event. I also want to personally thank the Brown American Studies Department, and specifically Dr. Marissa Brown, for her expertise throughout this entire research process. My name is Rhone O'Hara, and I use she, her pronouns. As you've heard, I graduated from Trinity College in 2020 with a degree in English and history. This spring, I graduated from Brown University with a master's in American Studies, where I have engaged primarily in archival, ethnographic, and interview-based research. My work has broadly focused on the intersections of gender, race, sexuality, ability, the carceral state, practices of citizenship, food studies, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today, I will be sharing with you all a few sample questions from a comprehensive 34-page original diversity, equity, and inclusion audit that I created tailored to the field of preservation. My hope is that today's conversation will be a starting point for all of us in this virtual room to think and speak critically about the role we each play in perpetuating and dismantling systems of oppression. Before starting, I would also like to acknowledge my own positionality in a discussion like this. As a white person in this space, I am conscious of my whiteness and that this presentation is not an attempt to speak for or over those my efforts seek to assist. I begin today by introducing terminology that I will engage throughout this presentation. Below is the language I will use to refer to marginalized communities and identities. First, diversity, equity, and inclusion frameworks. Diversity, the presence of different types of people, such as people of different races, cultures, gender identities, sexualities, socioeconomic status, education, and physical and mental ability in a group or organization. Equity, the notion that each organization member or community member receives the same treatment, opportunity, and resources regardless of gender, sexuality, race, ability, or socioeconomic status. Inclusion, the intentional and institutional incorporation of traditionally marginalized identities, allowing their access to resources and various opportunities. Diversity, equity, and inclusion subjects. BIPOC, meaning Black and Indigenous people of color. Non-normative, not conforming to or reflecting an established norm, deviating from a specific standard of comparison for a group or group of people. Queer, the umbrella term used to describe those who identify in the LGBTQIA+ community, those who do not identify as straight or cisgender. So, why is diversity, equity, and inclusion important to the field of preservation? In light of the past calendar year, issues of ongoing and systemic oppression have been made visible by the coronavirus, Black Lives Matter protests, the removal of Confederate monuments, and nationwide political turbulence. Similar to its sister institutions, the field of preservation is at a crossroads. Will it continue to preserve and prioritize mainstream, wealthy, white histories? Or can the field be reformed in a way that actively and intentionally gives a platform to subaltern, forgotten, or destroyed voices? As such, why is it important that preservation organizations understand how their work impacts the cultural landscape of the United States? Preservation organizations already play an active role in perpetuating, representing, and memorializing historical narratives and collective ideologies. Thus, it becomes imperative now and always to reframe how preservation can not only help to include underrepresented histories, but to facilitate the rewriting of history. Historic preservation has extensive cultural reach as it accounts for time, space, culture, history, communities, and most importantly, people. Preservation in the American context specifically has the power to uphold and legitimize the stories and materials that reflect our societal values. Currently, there are a number of national preservation projects that we may look to as leaders and innovators when it comes to ethically incorporating diversity, equity, and inclusion into the field of preservation. For example, in November of 2017, the National Trust for Historic Preservation launched the largest preservation effort ever undertaken to support African American historic sites, known as the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. The Cultural Heritage Fund includes a $25 million campaign to support 150 historic places that have been overlooked in American history and represent centuries of African American activism, achievement, and resilience. By actively partnering with Black communities, this project seeks to provide a more accurate and holistic history of the United States. Similarly, in 2020, the National Trust for Historic Preservation began its multi-year campaign called Where Women Made History to honor the contributions of female activists and community organizers. Their goals are to preserve and refund 100 sites of women's history and to discover 1,000 places where women made history in order to elevate their stories and begin to reshape the historical narrative to better include women and queer folk. While each of these projects that the National Trust has initiated requires a certain level of funding that is not accessible to every historic preservation organization, the key to their success is collaboration. By collaborating with marginalized communities, the National Trust has created a space both contemporarily and historically for alternate voices to become initiators in their own storytelling. This kind of conscious collaboration is a very plausible way for all of us to challenge the existing narratives in our own communities. This kind of collaboration is the major motivator behind my research and this audit. Inspired by interviews with 9 preservationists from 5 different organizations, historical archives, diversity audits from major universities, and community members, what follows is a proposed audit template for diversity, equity, and inclusion that seeks to encourage preservation organizations to become intentional and focused agents of change. The purpose of this audit is to reflect on and evaluate an organization's current status of racial, gender, ability, and class inclusivity. the people, as well as the projects and programming it engages. The audit will ask organizations to report specific numerical employee demographics, budget figures, and future plans so as to add levels of transparency in order to incorporate diversity more deeply into the participating organization. The audit will also provide a space for community members to comment on the local impact of the respective organization, as well as offer a set of recommendations. Thanks to the insights from community members recently affected by preservation efforts, as well as 9 leading preservationists, this DEI audit provokes questions which seek to address how to bring preservation into the 21st century. Those interviewed in this project, both civilians and experts, agreed that the pace of change and complexity of the American cultural landscape requires a more systematic self-study. This proposed audit is a first step in facilitating that institutional self-awareness. This audit, first and foremost, enables institutional reflection and self-awareness. It also aims to hold organizations accountable for their long-standing contributions to the field of preservation as it relates to the historical and narrative inclusion of non-white, LGBTQIA+, disabled, or low-income narratives and experiences. For a long time, preservation organizations have neglected or underappreciated the histories of Indigenous, BIPOC, queer, and non-able-bodied people. The hope is that this audit is an integral step in motivating preservation organizations to rethink and acknowledge their role in upholding traditional and often damaging systems. Additionally, this audit seeks to highlight how preservation organizations can benefit from employing such values and inspire creative ways of thinking about preservation. The mutually beneficial relationship that can result from this type of work is valuable both monetarily and morally. I will now be sharing sample questions from the audit. Please keep in mind that this is a model audit and is not case specific. Audit team. Has your organization created an internal team that will conduct this annual audit? If so, please share the selection criteria your organization used to create this important audit committee: size, demographics, area of expertise, qualifications. Are there members of your audit team that are credentialed, trained, or certified in DEI implementation and practice? Programming. How many programs during the year did your organization execute that promoted or recognized underrepresented histories or cultures? Please describe the process by which the organization decides which programs to fund and/or maintain annually. Projects. How has the surrounding community been involved in this project? Please discuss the intention of this project and its desired outcome. Interdisciplinary preservation methods. To what extent is oral history integrated into the organization's ongoing projects or programming? Does your organization make use of digital humanities, digital mapping, visual recreation? Please describe and explain. Please describe any current creative practices your organization has adopted. Community-based evaluation. In this section, please allow the surrounding community to evaluate the impact of your organization. This evaluation should be completed by representatives of the community that may include religious, social, or economic leaders and community organizers. Please consider asking each of these questions to community members without a professional relationship to the organization and those who are not paid partners of the organization to ensure community independence. Community-based evaluation continued. Please describe your own relationship with this preservation organization. Does this organization include community members when making decisions about public space? Are you currently collaborating with the organization on a preservation project or program? If so, please describe. If not, please explain why not. What does the organization do well in terms of how it impacts the greater community? What are some suggestions for how the organization can improve its work with marginalized histories? Please add additional comments or suggestions below. The future of preservation. Preservation, by its very nature, is a sensitive and nuanced profession of preserving. This does not mean, however, that preservationists in the field of preservation cannot become more institutionally aware of longstanding biases and dominant cultural narratives. Preservation organizations hold tremendous institutional, social, and historical significance that requires a great responsibility. It is time for the field of preservation to move beyond the mere restoration or conservation of buildings, physical artifacts, and land. Material objects, in the end, tell stories, narratives, and history of people. At the very heart of preservation are people. This audit was inspired by those who have long been forgotten or omitted from traditional preservation practices. Preservation is more than what simply appears on the National Register. Preservation is a reflection of what we and our society values, uplifts, and protects. People of color and non-normative identities deserve a place in historic preservation, as those people and their identities have always and will always exist. This audit does not aim to be complete or comprehensive in the way that it addresses diversity, equity, and inclusion. Instead, it aims to provide the field of preservation with first steps to evolve and keep pace with a changing society that demands the inclusion of underrepresented, subaltern, and oppressed histories. There is much work to be done as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion across global institutions, and preservation can be an inspiring place to spark that change. Thank you, everyone, and I think now we will open it up to broader discussion.
We really appreciate you sharing your research on this. And I just had one kind of follow-up question, which is, as you have organizations using your audit, will you be collecting their results and sharing that information, or is it something meant to just share with institutions and they keep the results?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now, the way in which it's designed is to be malleable based on each association or organization to fit their best needs. So whether that is, addressing internal issues and external projects, or whether that's something that they outsource to, people that they partner with, as it stands right now, it's malleable for both, I'd say.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, it is our opportunity now to open up the floor to broader discussion. So I'd like to introduce our other panelists for our discussion this afternoon. Mary A. Falvey is the Executive Director of the Hartford Preservation Alliance, a nonprofit organization that advocates for the use of historic preservation as an economic development and planning tool in area towns and cities. She also serves as the president of Connecticut Preservation Action, the statewide preservation advocacy group, and is chair of the Communications and Marketing Committee for Hartford Next, the coalition of Hartford neighborhood revitalization zones. The Connecticut chapter of the American Institute of Architects awarded Mary their 2016 Public Service Award in recognition of her work in this field. And Mary, on top of all of those other things, is currently enrolled in the Masters of Public History program at Central Connecticut State University. Welcome, Mary. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for having me today.
Jonathan Kinney joined the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office as the new Director of Operations and Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer in July of 2020. Before coming to Connecticut, he served as the Senior Historic Preservation Specialist with the New Jersey's Historic Preservation Office, where he served as the statewide coordinator of the Certified Local Government Program. Jonathan worked with local historic preservation commissions from all over New Jersey, providing technical assistance and training in managing a small grant program to support the commission's efforts to identify and preserve their community's irreplaceable historical resources. Jonathan received a BA degree from the College of New Jersey, an MA in history from William Patterson University, and a certificate in historic preservation from Burlington County College. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Happy to be here.
Jane Montanaro is the Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, formerly known as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation. She has been with the organization since 2005, serving in a variety of roles, including Membership Manager, Preservation Services Officer, Director of Preservation Services, and now as Executive Director. She currently serves on the boards of Connecticut Preservation Action, the Adam Stanton House Museum, and the Coltsville Heritage Partnership. Prior to joining Preservation Connecticut, Jane worked as a designer at DuBois Associates Architects here in Hartford, and she earned her Bachelor of Science in Architecture at Temple University in 1992. Welcome, Jane.
Thank you, Rebecca.
James Quinn is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Archaeological Program Manager for the Mohegan Tribe. James holds a BA in Anthropology from the University of Connecticut and an MS in Organizational Leadership from Quinnipiac University. He has worked in the tribe's archaeology program since 2006, and James was named as the tribe's first Tribal Historic Preservation Officer in 2010, and also at the same time as the manager of the archaeology program. His work focuses on preserving sacred and historic Mohegan sites, advocating for tribal sovereignty, and fostering a more ethical and inclusive field of archaeology. Welcome, James. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. Nice to hear. Really appreciate it.
And then last but not least is Maisa Tisdale, and she has, I've gone alphabetically if anyone's picked up on that. Maisa Tisdale has advocated for the preservation of the Mary and Eliza Freeman houses since 1994 and founded the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community in 2009 after coordinating a successful movement to save the homes from demolition. Maisa led the Freeman Center as a volunteer until 2019 when she became the Freeman Center's first professional staff member. Over the past 10 years, not only has she focused on the restoration of the Freeman houses, but Maisa has worked to create a safer and healthier built environment in Bridgeport's South End, focusing on historic preservation, community development, and climate change. Welcome so much. I'd like to just remind our audience members that please feel free to jump into the conversation with your comments, because we would love to hear your thoughts and your comments for our distinguished panel. It's great to have all of you with us today. And to get the ball rolling, I'd like to just start out by asking each of our panelists to just talk a little bit about your organization, introducing it, and talk a little bit about what you do at your organization. And maybe what the easiest thing to do, since we're on a Zoom kind of format, is I feel like the teacher in the room, but I can call on everyone, if that makes sense, to make it a little bit easier. So Maisa, how about we start with you?
Hi, so I'm the president and the CEO of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community, and our organization owns the Mary and Eliza Freeman houses circa 1848, and they're the last remaining structures of an 1821 antebellum community of people of color. So they're extremely significant, even though they're wood frame buildings, because the history of antebellum communities of color, well, just those histories are so underrepresented. So what our goal is to create an African-American historic site consisting of a museum, an education center, a digital humanities center, and housing. And we use preservation and restoration as catalysts for neighborhood revitalization. So what that means is that my job is focused on preservation-based equitable development. So we're multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and we're looking at having an impact on the community around us, on issues that actually have an impact on the lives. We recognize that our center will not be doing its job if it doesn't make things better. So what exactly is preservation-based equitable development? The definition is place-based interventions that address the physical and cultural needs of existing and new residents, particularly of underrepresented groups. These interventions support investment in the continued use and interpretation of physical places to enhance sustainable health outcomes, accessibility, and economic vitality. This is a form of development that empowers communities to direct and manage change in the physical environment and protect their history while ensuring that the use and activation of historic structures continues to benefit the futures of communities. So what that means my job entails is that, yes, I am responsible as the president and CEO. I'm responsible for making sure that the houses themselves become restored, but I'm also in charge of making sure that we have a real impact on the community around us and on the lives of the 600 families who live in other structures that are on the National Register of Historic Places.
Thank you. Why don't we go to James next? Oh, you're muted, James.
Sorry. Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. Hello, all. Thank you to the organizers of the event and to my fellow panelists. As mentioned, I'm James Quinn. I'm a Mohegan tribal member, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, and the Archaeology Program Manager for the tribe. I'm honored to serve my tribal community and owe so much to everyone that came before me and fought so hard to preserve and perpetuate our tribal heritage. So without them, there's no Mohegan tribe as you see it today. So the Mohegan Tribal Historic Preservation Office, established in 2010, our functions focus on surveying tribal lands, identifying and inventorying traditional, historic, and sacred Mohegan sites, maintaining our tribal register of historic places, preparing and updating our tribal historic preservation plan, and encouraging responsible development on Mohegan lands. A lot of the work we do with inventorying and identifying utilizes our oral history and traditions in helping to identify sites, although we also have a very robust archaeology program and a research component that supplements our oral history. Another major component of the work we do is working with federal agencies on a government-to-government basis under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Section 106 requires federal agencies to consult with federally recognized tribes with an interest in a given area that's proposed for a federally funded, permitted, or sponsored project. Tribal lands in the federal context essentially means reservation or trust lands. However, many important tribal sites are no longer accessible or owned by the tribe or part of our reservation, but well within our ancestral homelands and are still highly important for a variety of reasons. So federal consultation is one avenue for federally recognized tribes to engage and try to protect those places located off reservation, off tribal lands, but within our ancestral homelands. Another huge component of what we do is our educational in-reach to our tribal membership and outreach to our non-tribal neighbors. My great-great-uncle Harold Tanaquidgeon, his father John, and sister Gladys were highly involved in engaging our non-tribal neighbors. Together in 1931, they built the Tanaquidgeon Museum, which is still in operation today, 90 years later. The museum has served as a bridge between our tribal community and our non-tribal neighbors, with the hope that with the understanding comes inclusion and equity. Harold was also well known for his involvement with outside activities and teaching children about Mohegan traditions. And a favorite quote of his that I love regarding his work with children is, "One day, when some of them, children, grow up to become congressmen and senators voting on Indian issues, maybe their visit here will guide them to vote the right way." So we try to continue that here in the present. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be a part of this panel today and have a chance to speak on such an important issue. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Mary, did you want to go next?
Sure, yes, and thank you again for having me here on the program today. So here at Hartford Preservation Alliance, we were established in 1998 as a purely volunteer organization and have since brought on staff. Our main mission has always been to revitalize, connect, and collaborate with the residents of Hartford in preserving our historic neighborhoods. We're the chief advocate, we feel, for the little over 5,300 buildings that are located in historic districts in Hartford. And we do that in a variety of ways, but an important thing since I've taken over as executive director is I've made it a very important part of my job to attend the NRZ, which in Hartford is our neighborhood associations, neighborhood revitalization zones, and meet with them both to educate about what preservation is. And I find that pretty much everybody I meet in Hartford is interested in preservation. They just don't know that they're preservationists until I just tell them they are. But to collaborate with them and connect. I think a prime example of how we would do that is in our 2017 endangered buildings list. We had 40 Liberty. Liberty Street was aptly named. It was established as a street right at the end of the Civil War in 1865. And for 40 Liberty Street, it's a Second Empire. We're sure that it was a rather well-off white industrialist or capitalist in Hartford that built it. But to me, the most important thing was in 1905, a man by the name of Booker Jones purchased the house with his wife, Mary. And Booker and his wife, Mary, were African Americans born enslaved in Virginia and had arrived in Hartford in 1887. He worked as a coachman for many years for a judge and was able to purchase this house in 1905 and lived there till he died in 1930. And after he passed away, he's buried in Spring Grove Cemetery on Main Street, but in the segregated section. So it tells us a lot of stories about the people as we don't always think of in preservation. And there's the continuation of history through a building that I think is just so important.
Thanks, Mary. Jane?
Good afternoon, everyone. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit historic preservation organization. We were founded in 1975 by special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation to protect, preserve, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the State Historic Preservation Office, and for over 4 decades, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, and it's in a building listed on the National Register of Historic Places, the Eli Whitney boarding house for single working men who worked at the Eli Whitney gun factory. And it has served as our headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 8, 5 of which are women and 3 men, and a board of 22, 9 women and 6 minorities. And I'm pleased to say that on our panel today is one of our board members, James Quinn, and a former board member, Maisa Tisdale. So Preservation Connecticut is not a regulatory organization. We function as an organization that supports local preservation efforts. So we have 3 circuit riders that we deploy into the field whenever there's a call for service, and we provide community organizing. We listen to what the community needs are, and we provide support and bring in partners and funding sources and help with whatever the community is looking for assistance on. Oftentimes we are called in to prevent demolitions or to try to prevent a development. And we are oftentimes charged with how can we balance preservation goals while also facilitating development that will be beneficial for the community. So we like to say that we're the boots on the ground and your first stop to call for whenever you need someone to be your advocate in the community. Check with Preservation Connecticut and our team of circuit riders. And my role as the executive director there is to support this wonderful team that we have at Preservation Connecticut and all of the partners that we work with around the state.
Great, thanks. Jonathan?
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Jonathan Kinney. I am with the Connecticut SHPO. We are a state office located within the Department of Economic and Community Development in Hartford. The office was established in 1955, so that's 11 years before the National Historic Preservation Act, which sets up the SHPOs across the country as we know them today. And as an office, we administer a number of state and federal programs. We're sort of the, we oversee the governmental programs of historic preservation in the state. We administer state and federal programs such as the state and national registers of historic places, state and federal historic tax credit programs. We also have grant programs that are funded by both the National Park Service and the state's Community Investment Act. And we also do environmental review through a number of processes that provide a layer of protection and review by our office to try to avoid or minimize impacts to historic properties by undertakings and across the state. So as the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, I am in charge of supervising and supporting the staff there every day. We are currently operating under our strategic plan, the Statewide Historic Preservation Plan, the title of which is Shared Stewardship. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with that plan, but goal number 3 is very relevant to today's discussion. And that goal states that it is our mission to strengthen our commitment to documenting social history and recognizing significant historic places associated with a variety of communities. And that's something we're striving to do every day in our work. Thank you.
Thanks. And Rhone, do you want to share, after graduation, you're already employed, and maybe talk a little bit about your current role?
Yeah, so I just accepted a full-time position at a company called Partner in Publishing, where I will be an analyst and a diversity, equity, and inclusion relationship builder, both within working with people both within the company and externally. So I'm really excited about that.
Great, thanks. Well, you know, in my introduction, I did just a very quick kind of definition of what historic preservation is. But I think to start with, and not everyone has to answer, but maybe a couple of folks want to chime in, but how would you define the historic preservation field for someone who's not familiar with it? How many people work as paid professional staff, and where do most people work in this field?
That's a really general question. At Preservation Connecticut, we like to say that everyone can be a preservationist, even those that think that don't identify as a preservationist. We are always trying to engage in new audiences and hear the stories of anyone that is involved in stewardship of a site in Connecticut or a building, a house, and now even collecting the stories of represented communities. So it's such a broad question, but preservationists are, trained professionals that we have on our staff who can assist you with historic tax credit applications, with grant applications, with stewardship plans for your building, with grant applications, and with community organizing. And of course, there's a great collection of architects and consultants that we have in Connecticut who are available to assist, and some of them you can find in our directory at preservationconnecticut.org. And certainly working with all of the preservationists at the State Historic Preservation Office and with preservationists around the state who are in local historic preservation organizations. There is quite a network of both professional, volunteer, and tangential trades that work in the preservation field.
Thanks, Jane. Maisa, I wanted to kind of just touch on something you said in introducing your organization, which is the project when you started in the 1990s. It seems like something that's very unique about the preservation work that you've been doing has been in that it's not just the one site, it's the whole community. And I wondered, when you started the project, Were there any examples of that, or did you kind of create it on your own, and you've been able to help work with others to kind of be community minded in that way, that it's not just one site, but it's actually the whole neighborhood that you're working to preserve and improve?
Right. Well, there were a few things that pointed to taking that approach with the neighborhood. One of the things is I always remembered a tour that I used to work with the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Arts and Culture, and I remember taking a tour and having meetings in Atlanta with the National Park Service when they were setting up, when they were going to restore Martin Luther King Jr.'s home. And the approach that they were taking was that you couldn't just go into a community, especially into a marginalized community, and just fix up one house. That that really didn't meet the needs or the spirit of the restoration. And they were coming up with plans for the entire community. And that always stuck in the back of my head that, how do you justify, especially in marginalized communities, if you're not in Newport where it's wealthy, or, on College Hill going up to Brown, or Annapolis, how do you justify sort of the infusion of funds into the restoration of the houses? Now, we know that that shouldn't even be an issue, all right? Because if you have a history that's important to the national narrative, that history ought to be upheld and invested in, just like other places that are preserved, because, say, George Washington slept there. But the reality is, how can we use any opportunity that we have to uplift the community as a whole? And in the end, we are obligated to be good neighbors, not just disinterested stakeholders, but African American communities especially. They expect their nonprofits to have a sense of giving back, just as an individual would. You give back to your community, you make that community a better place. And then in the south end of Bridgeport also, we have a number of just ordinary, everyday people who live in historic homes and maybe didn't realize the importance of that, or the social history that went along with their homes, and why it was so important to be able to tell the story of the contributions of women, of immigrants, of the working class, to this nation's industrial might, and to what this nation achieved on the world stage. So it became clear that our reach had to be larger. We had to be good neighbors. We had to be honor the values of the African American community that uphold cooperative work and responsibility and collective sort of economics, and have an impact. If we were a resource, if we had educated people and we had a stage, and we had to make that useful for everyone. There were just so many needs. So in Bridgeport, 100% of our kids qualify for a free or subsidized lunch. It's estimated that 68% of our population are functionally illiterate. We have to be more than good neighbors. We have to make our community better.
Mary, you talked a little bit about working with communities in Hartford with preservation and really coming to the needs of your local community. Can you talk a little bit more about some of your partnerships in the city and how you've worked together on various projects?
Sure. So one thing now that's going on, the Clay Arsenal neighborhood organization in the North End is working with both ourselves and a new developer. We had, for a couple years, we've had a building on Albany Avenue, which is the main drag route. It's really part of Route 44, connecting the suburbs to Hartford. Building at 270 Albany is owned by the city and has been in really bad condition for a long time. And it just is, as I have said a lot of times, when we have buildings like that in the city, especially on main roads, it's like a billboard saying Hartford has problems. This is what we're like, and it's not true. That's not how we operate at all, and how the people are. But because we've had conversations and we've established relationships, and relationships are just so important to all of the things that we do. The community itself went to a organization that recently came into Hartford to purchase a bunch of buildings subsidized by HUD. They are building a brand new community center on Center Street, and they've actually just recently reached out to these people to say, look, this new building is fine, but we actually want you to take over this building at 270 and renovate it, because it's a historic building. It's important to our community. And we would like to do that. So it's all about creating relationships. It's getting to know the neighborhoods, the people that live there, the people that work there, and what they're interested in and what's important to them.
I think a few of you have mentioned the fact that a preservationist can be anyone, and that sometimes you let people know that, oh, you're a preservationist and you didn't even know it. But I got, in 1995, I completed my degree in historic preservation, and even way back then in ancient history, and I think it continues to be one of the real ongoing issues in historic preservation, is really the lack of staff diversity and getting all types of people interested in pursuing careers in that. So how do we change that fact? How do we encourage people of all backgrounds to get involved in historic preservation? And I kind of want to give a special shout out to Rhone and Mary, as you're both recently graduated and currently completing graduate studies. Are things changing? And how do you see the field evolving?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think immediately what comes to mind is the initiators of projects. I think that it makes sense why an organization would geographically and demographically reflect the projects that it engages. So I think that my initial thought is a way to better engage diversity of all kinds, I think, would be to diversify the projects first and foremost.
If I can make a comment, I know it wasn't named for this one, but when you talk about involving more people in historic preservation, you have to ask, why would people become involved? Where they would become involved? How will they be paid? How will they be educated and trained? In other words, you're talking about the relevance of the projects. You're talking about access, funding, and training. And from my own personal and professional experience, when you say increase the diversity, the fact of the matter is somebody has to fund projects. Somebody has to recognize them as worthy, and then someone has to figure out, how to pay people and train people who will be there. So you have to look at the greater field and say, why is it that only 5% of the National Register of Historic Places deals, say, with African American history? And then if these places are located, who and what are in place to drive this restoration? I don't think there will be more diversity until, first of all, for African Americans, until more Black organizations are funded. Because we're the ones that will make the places for more than one or a token amount of people to be employed. So there has to be more funding and more networking in that regard. And also, when you think about government funding, I mean, we've benefited from government funding from the state, to the tune of $1.6 million after many, many years of making sure that we were seen. The Connecticut Trust assisted us. The African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund was there for networking and training and funding. When we go to work with a small army of preservationists from diverse backgrounds, but that's because we're working on a project that they relate to.
Mm-hmm. You really bring up an interesting point, Maisa, because within the museum field, just as a small kind of relationship to what you were saying, the conversation has been about with internships in the museum field, because I know back in, the dark ages when I went to school, oftentimes you were doing an internship and you weren't paid, you were doing it for the experience, but not everyone can do that. And that really makes it very exclusive for someone who is able to afford not to be paid. And so that's a really important point that you bring up. Other thoughts from our panelists?
I was just going to piggyback on something Maisa said. I think that she made such an important point about having to feel a connection to the history, to the preservation movement, because preservationists are obviously very passionate about what they do. And I bet if you asked every preservationist, there's probably one historic property when they were a kid or when they were in school that kind of got them hooked on it. So I think that connection, that personal connection to a resource or to the concept of preservation is so important. And that happens by having access to these sites and having access to the preservation field. So we're evaluating our programs in the office and sort of trying to take a deep look at whether or not there are any things in our programs that are limiting access or prohibiting access to certain communities. We obviously want to be identifying and protecting and investing in a very diverse range of resources that reflect as diverse a population as Connecticut has. And then obviously, as you mentioned, participation is so important. So we're always looking to diversify boards and staff as much as we can.
And I think, Jonathan, you bring up a really important point about you need to feel, and Maisa did as well, you need to feel passion for a project. And with it's kind of that, why should it matter? And when you feel that emotional connection, it makes you want to get involved. One of our audience members has asked a question of all of our presenters, and that is, might each of the panelists comment on how useful they would find a DEI audit for their respective organizations should this become a profession-wide practice?
I'm happy to answer that. I would very lucky that Rhone had reached out to us while she was working on this project. So we're so glad we were able to recommend her for this program to discuss this. But absolutely, I think this is very useful, especially looking for, we're a staff of one, it's me, with a very dedicated board and lots of great volunteers. But, we're coming up on next year need to relook at our strategic plan. And I think this will very much be a part of how we look at where we're putting our priorities. And also, absolutely, I think this should be a profession-wide practice. Really important questions being asked, even if it's hard just to get board members. So we're always working to get people involved, but specifically to the programs that we're working on in cities like Hartford, which are majority minority, that to make sure that we're including the community and how we can include the community in what we're doing for them, not at them.
Yeah, and that was a good point, a staff of one. So if you talk about diversity, How do you diversify a staff of one? You can't do that. I mean, maybe you can, I'm not sure, but that's extremely challenging. So the point of the matter is that somehow, other people have to be able to begin and advocate for their own projects so that they're their own staffs of one, but hopefully they'll grow into, a mature institution that employs even more people than one. And a lot of historic preservationists I see are working in very small organizations that maybe have 5 or 6 or 3. And so there's really, I don't think those organizations can picture dropping one of the staff they have to give someone else, to put someone else in that place. It might not even be practical. So there has to be more attention given to communities who through social movements advocate to save places and then putting the resources there. And that's the story of the Freeman Center. We were very much a grassroots movement, and we fought and we bit and we found allies, who helped us. The preservation community stepped up and took on, politicians with us. Otherwise, the houses wouldn't be standing and we wouldn't be there. The Connecticut Trust, the National Trust, they showed up, professors, and it was that kind of networking that was needed to hang on to a project that will, in fact, pay a diverse staff of historic preservationists and make sure that they have training.
I'd like to add that as well. Speaking from a federally recognized tribe perspective, which we have access to federal funding, such as the TIPO grant program, we have other funding that's accessible to us, but that's only for federally recognized tribes. And that recognition process is highly politicized and outrageously expensive and out of the reach for a lot of small tribal communities. So often the voices of our non-federally recognized cousins and friends go unheard because of their status. And so, like the voices of many other underrepresented communities. And so, during the pandemic, unfortunately, those communities have fell further behind. So I think it's really up to people and organizations that have a seat at the table already to take a hard look at their hiring practices, minority representation in the boardroom, in the higher levels of organizations such as Preservation Connecticut, businesses like environmental engineering and cultural resource firms, and at local federal and state planning agencies is sorely lacking and needed. So I think a great way to do that is to recognize, that's really an issue, is that access.
And if a volunteer shows up on your doorstep who doesn't look like your typical volunteer, include that person. I mean, I was interested in volunteering with the restoration of a mansion, and they looked me up. This is way, way back, early on. I had an interest in it. And they looked me up and down and said, we have no time slot for you. I'm so sorry. And the place was just crumbling around everybody's neck. I eventually had my first restoration experience on a ship, right? The Ernestina schooner out of New Bedford, Mass, that had a tie to African American history. And that in turn gave me the background that I needed to understand what sort of community Little Liberia was, and the seafaring history of people of color.
Those are all really important points, and opening the door to someone knocking on it who is willing to help, I think, is a really important one to remember. I wanted to talk a little bit about another aspect to historic preservation, and that is the fact that, I think when the historic preservation movement first got started, it oftentimes was the homes of great men. Mount Vernon was kind of the seminal preservation moment that we studied about at Mary Washington. And, I think beginning in the 1980s and 90s, there was a recognition that there needed to be more attention to preserving buildings that related to all kinds of buildings, not just the mansions of the wealthiest of our country. But obviously there's a ways to go on those efforts. And I wondered if you could speak to your efforts in terms of institutionally, how you're working on this issue. And I think, Jonathan, you had mentioned the strategic plan for SHPO, which kind of addresses that as well. And I'm sure, Jane, that Preservation Connecticut also has that in mind. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit on that issue.
Sure, absolutely. Oops. Sorry. Absolutely. And our National Register Coordinator, Jenny Schofield, has been great about being progressive in, trying to get diverse array of resources onto the register and our state register as well. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, we last year we did, just for an example, we gave a grant to the St. Anthony's Chapel Foundation, which is a Cape Verdean church in Norwich, to do a historic context and social history mapping, which is an interesting project, and we'll kind of hoping will reveal a history that's not well known in Connecticut. We also obviously have been working with the Connecticut Old State House with a grant for the Freedom Trail to get a outreach coordinator and strategic plan in place for that effort. So yes, we are actively trying to diversify both our audience and also the resources that we are investing in and trying to protect.
Yeah, and I would concur with that. Preservation Connecticut also is making efforts to be intentional in all of the programming that we do to be sure they're inclusive. During the pandemic, we started a series called Talking About Preservation, where we've done noontime chats. And these have been really wonderful opportunities to engage with communities that we aren't able to so easily in the field, but being able to put on a noontime Zoom chat with leaders in the historic Black churches, with a program at Salisbury School that students were studying the history of slavery in Northwest Connecticut. We had Maisa join us to talk about Little Liberia, the Freedom Trail. There was just a lot of opportunities to just gather people around and talk about opportunities in historic preservation and what other underrepresented communities were doing. And also Preservation Connecticut was able this year to be a partner in a coalition that was looking to advocate for some change in zoning laws at the state level. So we were partners with Desegregate Connecticut, and some changes were passed this year to promote, better, more expansive zoning in our communities by allowing accessory dwelling units to be used for housing, and training for planning commissioners to be more equitable, and defining the word character for our communities that really has to do with the architecture of the community. So wherever looking for opportunities as they present themselves and being intentional in how we do our work to make sure it is inclusive for all people of Connecticut.
If I might add, I think perception is a real issue in how we view the past, how we perceive the past. I think it's really based on the concepts of tangible versus intangible heritage. Tangible being things like the built environment, structures, even a written record, archaeology, artifacts. Intangible being things like ceremonies, traditions, that tribal communities or other minority underrepresented communities may have practiced at places, but oftentimes left no trace of those activities there. And so it can be a real struggle in my experience, getting people to understand and think of places in terms of the intangible. Like I said, a place may be important because the tribe gathered traditional plants there in the past, maybe held ceremony there to honor a season. And even though that place may be a parking lot now, that place may still be important to a tribe. And so I think changing the perception that once it's paved over, or if that, it doesn't have any structures or there's no artifacts, I think is a real, very important path forward towards a more inclusive view of history.
And that's where I think digital humanities will really be important to those of us whose histories either haven't been highlighted or have been erased, or where, cities are built on top of places where we had aspirations and where we achieved things. I've seen any number of amazing digital humanities projects that would allow us to put together a new view, a new perspective of our history, and then to present it in ways where people can actually see them. I mean, we've tried to do that through the arts by using artists and giving that history and teaching them about the archaeology so that then they can make it more visible. We don't have photographs of the Freeman sisters. We don't have photographs really of Little Liberia at all. I mean, it was established in 1821, so it's before the camera. But for example, we had artist renderings of the Freeman sisters that became a mural. And it was really an artist's way of showing that they existed. So we have to look for other ways. And so our preservationists also are people from other fields as well, not just the historians or the architects or the architectural historians, but artists and sculptors and playwrights. Oh, and construction workers.
Yeah.
Trying to tell the story of the site that they were restoring.
Right. So
I our artifacts.
I totally agree with that. And one thing that I've struggled, which I think has contributed to some of our diversity issues, is we call them the National and the State Register of Historic Places, but it's been very much skewed to historic buildings. And as you said, for example, in Hartford, that whole East Side neighborhood that is now Constitution Plaza had a lot of history for a lot of different groups that, how in preservation can we tie that together, which I try to do when we discuss, we bring in the modern architecture, but also what came before and how it connects.
And James, you brought up a really interesting point, which is how different communities might look at historic preservation, and certainly with the Mohegan tribe and other tribal nations, of the fact that archaeology is so key to the kind of preservation of memory. And here in Hartford, you may be aware of the project that Capital Community College is working on right now to recognize the Talcott Street Church, which was an activist, which continues as Faith Congregational Church historically, but was located on what is now a street, but had the members were such important activists in Hartford in the 1830s. And how do you recognize and remember the activism and the people of the church when the site is no longer in place? So I think you bring up a really important sense, and I think also in terms of historic landscapes as well, which is that place can involve more than just structures.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I was getting ready for today's program, I did a quick Google search like we all do these days. And the National Trust had a lot of great resources, and a lot of them did have to do with the issues we've talked about in terms of preserving different kinds of sites and buildings and encouraging more participation, community building, and preservation. As we're kind of thinking of wrapping up our program, what other issues do you see coming on the horizon for historic preservation in the coming years?
I think telling the whole story is one that has been really stressed by the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust. I think that's one. And I also think the disbursement of government funds, I don't think it should be just looked at as a favor or a privilege, a favor by the government and a privilege to individual groups. I mean, I think that government needs to look at taxes and also think about how much of the tax money is being invested in preservation in marginalized areas. So the money comes in, does the money go back out? And also teaching this inclusion in the state of Connecticut of teaching African American and other histories. I think that is something that's going to come up again, and people will discuss, because it has an impact on education and how much time teachers have to spend.
I think an ongoing issue is the ebb and flow of administrations coming and going, regional attitudes at office, federal agencies changing with administrations, the gutting and then rebuffing of federal preservation laws. So I think I don't know how to fix that. I don't know if that's fixable, but that's certainly always an issue. I mean, we just went through a previous administration really went after the regulatory environment, which NEPA was really attacked, and 106 was really kind of kneecapped and with a lot of agencies. So I think that's an ongoing struggle we face as TIPOs. The goalposts are always being moved on us. And there's constant turnover at federal agencies as well. So it's a constant change in attitude and perspectives. And there's for tribes, there's no standard way that agencies handle tribal consultation. There's no standard. They're left to their own devices. So that's another huge obstacle we constantly face.
Well, Maisa, you mentioned something in the introduction I read for you, which is climate change.
Right.
So
forget that.
Yeah, that's a kind of big one. With our panelists, do you see that also as having a really big impact on, I've been joking with friends over the years where I said, well, being frugal now, it's because having grandparents who grew up in the Depression where they were very frugal, but now, preservation is not just about saving great buildings and preserving, but it's also good for the environment. You're reusing things. It's become fashionable again. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about climate change and how you see that impacting historic preservation in the years ahead.
Well, there's that whole issue of keeping history above water. I mean, that the cities and the things that we save and hold dear are all in the areas that are being just challenged by the climate, whether it's flooding or fires or now tornadoes. We all, how do we save our culture and make sure that it physically and literally survives? But that also brings us to, again, how government resources, how society's resources will be spent to save certain aspects of this nation's history. And so when people are trying to figure out what's worthy of saving, will the marginalized histories be there? And will those histories be saved so that, again, the people matter? So that all of our lives matter. And that's something that we're working really hard on in Bridgeport, because we have a historical community that's in a flood zone, and we want to be sure that this history is told. It's just emerging. It's just getting a voice. Will it be told? And also, we were able to work over time closely with the state and figuring out how to place the barriers that would save us from flooding in such a way that it would also allow the community to not just showcase its history, but grow economically. So we are actually creating a climate resilient historic zone. We're excited about that. Is anyone else being impacted?
Yes, I mean, of course, this is a statewide issue as far as climate change and the impacts of historic resources. So we have to work closely with our federal partners, our local partners to first identify the resources that are threatened, and then come up with a plan or a strategy to either document those resources, figure out a way to protect them, and figure out what the range of treatment options are for these resources, if they can be elevated or relocated, or all in a way that minimizes harm to the resources, but also ensures that people will have access to them in the future and be able to enjoy them and learn from them in the future.
It's going to be interesting seeing how those issues are addressed as we go forward. I know that we've gone a little bit over, and I want to thank our panelists. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I feel like we could go on for a couple more hours, but I know we all have other things to do. But perhaps just as kind of a concluding statement for everyone, to audience members who are watching and thinking about, historic preservation, why in 2021 is historic preservation important and worth continuing to improve the field?
I can start that one if you don't mind. So I think it was Maisa earlier that said, this is it's the National Register of Historic Places, but we preserve these resources for people so that they have them and they can become a viable part of our present and our future. And preservation is really a quality of life field area. We're talking about educational benefits. We're talking about economic and environmental, as we just mentioned, and generating heritage tourism dollars for local areas, as well as cultural and social benefits of these. So preservation really touches on so many aspects of life, and we want to make sure that as many people as possible have access to those quality of life benefits.
Well, we're not just preserving buildings or even landscapes, we're preserving heritages and cultures. And until those heritages and cultures are shared, people are devalued. Mm-hmm. And in our case, it was so important to hang on to those houses because they were like beacons, they were beacons saying something else, something more was here. There was more history here. And so knowing that cultures and histories matter and having these sort of posts cultural posts where you can stop and reflect on that, it's really critical to our going forward together as a nation. And as a nation that is situated to take on the global issues also of our time, that kind of sensitivity and understanding that people and places matter is really important when we're facing global issues. And we're going to have to understand a lot of cultures far different and far-flung than our own.
I agree. I think how we collectively define what's important to us as a nation in terms of history really shapes how we perceive ourselves as a society. And I think, historic preservation can be a real catalyst for building a more inclusive and equitable society. But those voices of the underrepresented and minorities need to be included to tell the true story, the more, the real narrative of the history of this nation.
It brings people together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, and I think too, it is extremely important in making connections with the past, that even if the current person living in this house, quote unquote, looks different than the people before, when you really look at the stories, we're so much more connected. We have so much more in common with this heritage, and we're building on it. And I see it as a bridge to say, we're so much more alike than we are different.
And preservation really is a tool to build exciting and diverse communities with a lot of vitality. So I think we're seeing that as more and more groups are brought together and investments are made in communities. It really, the places that are exciting, where you want to be at, is where there is, a lot of cultures represented, and there's just a lot of great things happening. And I think preservation can be a force for change and in bringing vitality to our communities and connecting us to our culture and bridging us to the future.
I think I think also preservation can be a space to engage young people, especially young people who want to continue to find connections with their heritage, with their culture, with their knowledge. And I think it can also create a pathway and open up new lines of communication and questioning and creativity, especially if we work to engage younger generations as we move forward.
They are the future.
Yes, indeed. Well, I can't think of a better way to conclude our discussion today. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. It's been a really instructive, interesting conversation. And we've kind of made this an annual event with Mary and Jane to talk on preservation issues. So I hope we can do it again in about a year's time. But I want to thank all of you for sharing your time with us today. I want to thank our audience members for joining us. And I'd invite you to fill out the survey. We do truly read them and get ideas for programs, and appreciate your honest feedback. That survey is posted in the comments. So thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And we would invite you to spend more time checking out historic buildings and interesting stories this summer as we start reopening. A lot of sites are reopening, so we'd invite you to do a staycation in our state and hear some of the amazing stories that have taken place here. And we'd invite you to come to the Old State House this summer. We have a very busy summer planned. The farmers market takes place Tuesdays and Fridays from 10 to 2 p.m. And we also have our summer concert series, which kicked off last week. This Friday, we're welcoming Inner Groove. So you can bring your lunch, come sit outside in the sunshine, listen to some music, and do some shopping. And then exciting news for us, on July the 1st, we will be reopening here at Connecticut's Old State House. We'll be open to the public. And so we'll be open. You can see our open hours, Tuesday through Saturday, 12 to 5, except for Thursdays, we will have evening hours, 12 to 8 for the first time. So we hope to see you this summer. And I want to thank, and also you could join our team here. We're going to put in a shameless plug. We are hiring for part-time museum interpreter positions, and we'd love to have you join us. So go to our website, ctdemocracycenter.org/careers. Come join us at the Old State House. So thank you all again for joining us. It's been a great conversation. We hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
everybody.